My name is Ángeles Mendoza Samet. I'm going to present the 4th video on small hydropower developments and environmental impact assessment. The objective of this video is to summarize the main environmental impacts of small hydropower projects. Small hydropower projects can have different impacts, but these are determined by different characteristics of the project and the location. Small hydropower developments are considered as not having significant impacts, but recent research points to, in fact, they having impacts sometimes equivalent to large hydropower plants. Individually, small hydropower projects might be considered as having low or no impacts, but still can affect endangered species, hydrological processes, and even have social impacts. These impacts might not be evident on the short term, but they might occur on the mid to long term. The impacts might be influenced by the type of the plant. For example, if it's a run of the river, a diversion, if it is incorporated in water infrastructure, which would have less impacts, or if it is, for example, storage or pump storage. Also, the impacts might depend on the generation capacity, with very small developments, usually less than 5 kilowatts, or up to 100 megawatts, depending on the country. So there is no universal definition of what hydropower is when we are talking about the small one. Also, the head might have some influence. It might be very low, like 3 meters, or even high, up to 40 meters. This will also determine different aspects, for example, barriers for movement of flows of sediments, or also for species. However, often impact assessments are done in a very short time or with not enough data. This might also influence the significance of the findings. There are some studies that are trying to use different tools, for example, life cycle assessment, to compare what are the impacts of small and large hydropower developments, considering the production capacity, so impacts per megawatt produced. These studies have found that considering this production and the impacts, the longitude of the rivers are affected together with other characteristics. For example, different habitats, there are modifications of hydrological regimes, there are impacts on the endemic, rare, or threatened species, among others. Some of the reasons for small hydropower also have significant impacts is that in many cases they are located in sensitive areas. So it's easier to build a small hydropower plant in a remote location in an alpine environment than a large plant in other areas. Often, because of their size and capacity, many of these small hydropower developments are not considered in the regulations that require environmental impact assessments. Because of their small size in comparison to the energy that they produce, it is considered that the cost per megawatt is higher for small developments. However, the effects per megawatt produced are often larger. I'm going to summarize the studies of some articles that present research that has been done to try to understand more what are the different impacts of small hydropower developments. And one of them has been done in Lithuania. And one of the conclusions of this study is that the flows affected the flow of nutrients and suspended solids. This had consequences on the communities of macroinvertebrates. These changes in flow, for example, the rate that is altered by hydropeaking or river regulation, affect the biophysical conditions and the habitat supply for fish. The hydrological alterations caused by hydropeaking are considered to be similar to those of large hydropower plants. And also, they are even larger and impacts more significant when the developments consist of diversion. So the communities of macroinvertebrates, which are very important for the food chain, are affected by changes in water flow, in the amount and speed, and also by the concentration of suspended solids, nitrogen, and river area, conditions important for the development. These changes on water quality and aquatic communities are not detected in all cases, but it cannot be concluded with certainty that they are not evident or present if the assessments have not considered good monitoring. These impacts on macroinvertebrates will have repercussions through the food chain, changing the density and abundance of some species, fish for example. Also, it's needed to consider that in some areas that are relatively flat, these small hydropower developments might need large reservoirs to generate the capacity. Then the area affected is larger and consequently the impacts too. So one cannot deny that small hydropower has benefits, and you have been covered those in different modules or different lectures in this training. However, it's important to consider the negative impacts, especially when they might be against the idea that is used to promote small hydropower development, that their impacts are very low or not significant compared to large hydropower dams. So different studies have found that small hydropower developments can change the density and abundance of some species, not only aquatic species, but also other species that depend on them. So whether they are in isolated areas or areas that are pristine without much development, areas that are sensitive, for example, in alpine meadows or other locations, and the type of hydropower development will influence the changes in water quality and biological communities. These negative impacts will happen despite low or lack of production, especially in seasons where there are no flows or there is low flow. And this is because the alterations are being done despite the turbines working or not. So it has found that when these developments are located in mountain ecosystems, they contribute more to their degradation. However, they also have social impacts. So small hydropower developments not only affect the environment, but also communities. One of the ways in which they do that is that they contribute to the monopolization of natural resources. Although some of these small developments are owned by communities, Often they are done by investors or energy companies that might restrict the use of resources or water for the communities that have used them for a long time. They also might disrupt traditional irrigation systems and water mills. In some cases, they might require people to be displaced physically or economically, so they can contribute to inequality on the distribution of benefits, especially with the communities that are affected by small hydropower projects. In Turkey, for example, there was a study that compared 40 different small hydropower projects ranging from half to 25 megawatts. The authors found that only 16 of those 40 had prepared reports on the environmental impacts and impacts on biodiversity in areas where there were different species that could be considered endangered or threatened or in other categories. Also, those assessments did not consider that there would be social impacts from the expropriation of lands to produce or build the electricity or the plants. Several of these developments were located inside protected areas with more consequent impacts on the quality of the protected areas, the landscape, but also on the rare features that they try to protect. The impacts were caused, for example, because of the degradation of habitat due to the construction and operation, for example, blasting and building roads or transportation of materials, by the construction of power lines, which can have health impacts on the population and on animals, but also visual impacts on the landscape. Also impacts because of the pollution caused by the improper disposal of solid and liquid waste, including human waste. There were also impacts because of dust and noise that were generated from all the construction of materials and the traffic associated. After the construction was done, some impacts also resulted because the restoration of habitat was not done as it should have been. Impacts on wildlife resulted because this access created for the plants facilitated illegal hunting by workers but also by locals. These impacts are greater and accumulate when there are different small hydropower developments in a river system. Another study in China, in the New River Basin, also compared 13 large hydropower plants with 100 small hydropower plants. And the purpose was also to analyze whether small hydropower plants could have similar or different impacts than the large ones. And they considered the total capacity of these plants. For example, the large dams had a total capacity of 3,400 megawatts, while 31 small hydropower plants had a total capacity of 417 megawatts. The authors found that per megawatt of production capacity, the small hydropower plants caused larger cumulative impacts than the large ones in terms of the length of the river channels that had been affected, also the diversity of habitats affected because of changes and disruptions and degradation of areas that were designated as conservation priorities, also because of modification on the flow and hydrological regimes in the rivers, and because these changes also contributed to modifications in water quality. Another study in the Balkans considered also what happens because of the investment in these projects. And they focus especially in the finance done by banks for small hydropower developments. And they consider and found in the assessment that there is proliferation of small hydropower projects because they are easier to build and approve, even if they are located in sensitive areas. And this is because many of these developments are excluded from environmental assessments, mainly because they have a small generating capacity and they are assumed to not have negative impacts. Only a few presented environmental impact assessments, and those were found to be deficient. So not analyzing, for example, impacts on biodiversity and not having proper data to conclude. By considering how these developments were managed after being put in operation, they found that there is lack of monitoring and almost no restoration of the lands that were affected. So this means that there is no good follow-up by the authorities, so the mitigations are not implemented. Also, they found that in many of the countries in which they did the comparison, there is weak governance. And this allows for proponents to try to maximize the profits and not consider complying with the mitigations. And also, there is no enforcement of the authorities to ensure that these developments are not affecting the environment. So what can be done to make small hydropower developments more sustainable, to really deliver benefits without having negative impacts, sometimes larger than the larger dams, especially when considering them as a group? Well, the approach is not to rely only on the environmental and social impact assessments done individually for each one of these plants, or not be developing when many of these plants are not even considered to have impacts. So environmental impact assessments are not the right tool to determine the impacts of small hydropower projects. And that is what is shown in this diagram. We can have impacts coming from one project, but when it adds to the impacts of other, not only other hydropower projects, but also other activities in the area, we can have a magnification of impacts, we can have additions, but we can also have synergistic relationships in which the impacts are larger than if we were just adding the impacts of individual projects. So these compounding effects need to be considered at regional level to a strategic environmental assessment. So strategic plans, for example, regional development plans or sectoral plans for energy, for example, need to undergo a strategic environmental assessment to identify the potential benefits and impacts that the developments or the plans to develop hydropower could have, not only on the environment, but also on people. A strategic assessment also will help identify areas where small hydropower developments and even larger hydropower developments could be or not could be located because of the sensitivity of the areas, but also because of the potential to generate cumulative effects, not only on the landscape, on species, but also on human communities. Also, the results of a strategic assessment could help compare different policies to seek their consistency with achieving sustainable development objectives and not to have them competing. For example, achieving energy while compromising the condition of the environment and contributing to the reduction in biodiversity. Once regional plans have analyzed the impacts and propose or recommend changes to make development more sustainable, environmental and social impact assessments can be used for individual projects. For example, if developments are not authorized in sensitive areas, that could reduce their potential to generate negative impacts, so that would also could simplify the assessment of the individual projects and facilitate their approval. To conclude this video, I want to just highlight some points. So there is variation on the type and significance of impacts of small hydropower plants. And this is because there is a large variety of small hydropower developments. They have different characteristics and they are located in different areas. So all this combines to have this diversity on findings where in some cases impacts are detected, in others no. But assessments need to be in a case-by-case basis and is needed to consider developments in a regional or basin level. Because the evidence is pointing to small hydropower projects, especially considering cumulatively have even larger impacts than similar larger hydropower plants. So often it happens that small hydropower developments are conducted in areas where there is not much information or in countries where there is no good practice for environmental assessment. This also might result in that many of the impacts are not even detected. So using only assessments for single projects can be misleading. It is important to consider the long-term, regional, and cumulative effects on the natural and human environment. And for that, strategic environmental assessment is more appropriate to plan how to develop small hydropower in a basin or region and really help it contribute to sustainable development. Here you have a list of references that you can use if you want to know more about what was presented in this video.